You feel great, don't you? Because I can just tell you're like healthy.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Do you care about age? Do you think about like, oh, I'm going to be 90? Does that matter to you?
I don't think about it. I sometimes think when I was a little kid and I used to hang out with my grandfather who was in his 90s, and I thought, Jesus, who the hell would want to live this long?
Yeah.
He built a career out of saying almost nothing. For more than 60 years, Clint Eastwood made silence the most powerful sound in cinema. The squint, the pause, the long, empty beat before the draw. He taught audiences that the man who talks least is the one to fear. 2 Oscars for Best Picture, 2 for Best Director. The face of a genre that defined a generation. The last living bridge between the golden age of Hollywood and everything after it. And now, Hollywood is silent. Not because it has nothing to say about him, and not because his work has faded. If anything, the opposite is true. The industry that once couldn't stop talking about Clint Eastwood has watched him make his final exit, and it has barely said a word. He can't hide it anymore, and neither can anyone else of his generation, because the truth stopped being something a man could keep behind a pair of eyes and a closed mouth. It's in the rooms he doesn't enter, the premieres he skips, the quiet of Carmel by the Sea, where the most famous cowboy in the world now lives in a silence he chose for himself. So here's the question this story is asking. What does it mean when the man who taught the world to keep its mouth shut finally keeps his own? What happens when the town that built him into a legend simply falls quiet? Has the place you gave your life to ever stopped speaking your name? Leave a comment, because that question is the heart of this story. Stick around, because before we get to the stillness of the present, we need to go back to when Hollywood couldn't look away from him. When the quiet cowboy was the loudest voice on the planet. Clint Eastwood was not born into the movies. He was born on May 31st, 1930, in San Francisco, in the middle of the Great Depression, in a country that had run out of money and patience at almost the same time. His father, Clint Eastwood Sr., worked as a salesman and took whatever jobs he could find, chasing work up and down the West Coast during the Depression. His mother, Ruth, worked various jobs to help support the family. The family moved several times, from the Bay Area toward the Central Valley and back, as his father sought steady employment wherever the Depression left it. It was a childhood spent in motion, watching a family work to stay afloat with very little. Out of that, a quiet boy grew up in a loud and uncertain world. He wasn't a star student or a theater kid. He learned early that words were expensive, and that a man's value was measured by what he endured, not what he promised. When you were growing up, what did the hard years teach you about how to speak to the world, or how not to? Tell us in the comments, because for Eastwood, the answer became something close to a philosophy. By 1940, the family had settled for good in Piedmont, California, where Eastwood spent the rest of his childhood and teenage years. In 1951, during the Korean War, Eastwood was drafted into the Army and stationed at Fort Ord in California. There he became friends with a fellow serviceman who used his connections in the film industry to get Eastwood an audition with a Universal Pictures director, though he had no way of knowing yet how much that meeting would change his life. He spent years in the unglamorous middle of things, taking odd jobs, no closer to the movies that seemed to belong to other people. The story that made him a star didn't begin with a script. It began with a rejection so complete that most men would have taken it as the final word. In 1955, after only a handful of minor roles, Universal Pictures dropped him from his contract. He wasn't a name. He wasn't handsome in the way studios wanted. He was too tall, too rough, too quiet, and there seemed to be no market for a man who could barely be bothered to talk. Years of small television roles followed, until a supporting part on the Western series Rawhide finally gave him his breakthrough in 1959. By the mid-1960s, still without much of a film career to speak of, Eastwood took a gamble that would change everything. So he went to Spain. It's hard now to appreciate how risky that decision was. Eastwood crossed the Atlantic for a project almost nobody in the industry believed in. A series of low-budget Italian westerns made by a young director named Sergio Leone. The films had almost no American backing, They were shot cheaply in the Almeria Desert in Spain, with dubbing that made the performances sound strange to American ears. On paper, it was the kind of gamble that ends careers. But Leone saw something the studios had missed, that the quietest man in the room can be the most powerful one if the camera is patient enough. He built an entire mythology around Eastwood's natural reserve, the man with no name. A stranger drifts into town, says almost nothing, lets everyone underestimate him, then removes the entire room with a squint and a draw faster than the eye. A fistful of dollars in 1964. For a few dollars more in 1965. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in 1966. 3 films that redefined the Western, made the anti-hero the most compelling figure in cinema, and turned an actor Hollywood had rejected into one of the most recognizable faces on earth. Watch that footage and notice what Eastwood isn't doing. He isn't emoting or explaining. He's holding, letting the moment build until the audience is holding its breath too. Plenty of people ridiculed the style, and every studio that followed copied it, but no one has done it quite like Eastwood, because no one else grew up in the specific silence he did. When someone succeeds by being underestimated, does the world ever really see them? Or does it just see the character they built to survive? Leave your thoughts below, because that gap between the public legend and the private man runs through this entire story. By the late 1960s, Eastwood was no longer the actor Hollywood had rejected. He was the actor it could no longer ignore. But unlike stars who rushed to cash in, he did something unusual for the era. He turned his attention behind the camera. Dirty Harry, in 1971, gave the world his second great archetype, Harry Callahan, a detective so reckless and single-minded that the character became a national battleground. Critics called him a fascist. Audiences made him a box office sensation. Eastwood never flinched. He seemed to understand that the real argument in America wasn't between parties, but between the values of order, discipline, and individual will he represented, and an industry beginning to drift away from them. And underneath all of it, he was learning to direct. That part of his story matters more than any single film. He taught himself the craft by sitting inside every stage of production, and he became known for a furious, disciplined, minimal style. Eastwood was notorious for finishing scenes in 1 or 2 takes, for refusing to waste money, for cutting like a man who already knew what he wanted before the cameras rolled. By almost any measure, he was the most efficient filmmaker of his generation, running a set with total economy and total control. For all the shootouts and anti-heroes, the world that respected him most was the one he'd quietly outgrown, the industry itself. What's the price you've paid for the discipline other people praised you for? Eastwood paid one, and it took decades, including for himself, to understand it. By the mid-1990s, Clint Eastwood hadn't just survived Hollywood. He'd become its unlikely conscience. In 1992, at 62, an age when most action stars are fading into nostalgia, Eastwood released Unforgiven. It tore down everything he'd once been known for. The man with no name, the squint, the violence, all of it brought back to its brutal, sorrowful truth. It won Best Picture and Best Director, and he accepted both in the same gravel voice that had built his legend in the first place. In 2004, he did it again. Million Dollar Baby told the story of a fighter, a trainer, and the moral weight of mercy. It won Best Picture and Best Director a second time. 2 films, 2 wins in the same career, and each time Eastwood looked almost uncomfortable with the praise, as if the ceremony were noise and the work was the only thing that mattered. He was never simple, though. Alongside films that celebrated discipline, he made decisions and said things that were fiercely his own, rejecting political correctness before it was even a term, going against an industry that increasingly demanded agreement. He held a certain idea of American selfhood, independence, and responsibility, and he held it as steadily as he held the frame of a shot. He was loved and criticized in equal measure, often at the same time, and he never apologized for any of it. That's the Clint Eastwood the world knows, the legend of restraint, the man who never wasted a word, a dollar, or a bullet. a symbol of a kind of American strength that doesn't need anyone else's understanding because he can carry the weight himself. But there's a truth the cameras never caught. Here's what the myth was hiding, because legends aren't born finished. They're maintained by silence. Eastwood's method, the one-take, minimal budget, total control approach, wasn't simply a stylistic choice. It was a philosophy of self-reliance pushed close to the absolute. He trusted almost no one more than himself, and he carried the weight of production, of legacy, of image, of an entire career inside a man who didn't ask for help by nature. That works remarkably well for a director in his prime. It's much harder for a man whose body and age eventually talk back. There's something else too, harder to see from outside, the people around him. Eastwood had a large family, many children from different relationships, across a life lived on his own terms. He had public fights with former partners and legal battles, and his career stayed the center of gravity in his life. The man who taught the world discipline spent that discipline in his private life on control rather than on vulnerability. That's the hidden cost. Not a headline, not a scandal, just the ordinary truth that the strongest people are often the last to learn how to be known, not just admired. What's something you've had to be strong for that no one ever taught you how to carry? That's the question the rest of this story is built on. Eastwood always had a way of surprising people. Even in his 80s, he kept directing. Gran Torino at 78. The Mule at 88. A film about an old man who's become invisible to the world and quietly does one last, reckless, illegal thing. It's hard to watch The Mule and not see Eastwood looking at himself in the mirror. Then in 2024, at 94, long past the point the industry expects anyone to stop, he released Juror No. 2, a quiet legal thriller. Many critics called it a return to his best work. And this is where the silence begins. Because that final film reached the world in a way that stunned his own collaborators and angered plenty of his admirers. It received only a limited theatrical release, opening in fewer than 50 theaters across the entire country. The industry's most influential living director sent his final work into a marketplace that gave it barely a ripple. What many expected to be a loud, dignified send-off for a legend was instead handed out quietly, almost apologetically, the way you'd release something the industry no longer knew what to do with. Then came the final word. In 2026, Eastwood's son Kyle confirmed what many had suspected for months. His father had retired, and Juror No. 2 would very likely be his last film. Eastwood was 96, a man who'd resisted even saying the word retirement for a decade. A widely circulated 2025 interview had quoted him vowing to keep working no matter his age, but Eastwood later confirmed through his representatives that the interview had never actually happened and was entirely fabricated. Even his own family eventually let the silence answer the question. So the world got its answer, the way Clint Eastwood always gave them. Not with a speech, but with an ending. No farewell tour, no closing press conference, no industry montage. Just a film, a barely there release, and quiet. At 90, and on into his mid-90s, the one thing he could never admit isn't hidden anymore. He'd reached the end of the work that defined him, and the Hollywood that made him rich and famous and immortal, the Hollywood that built its own image partly on the kind of man he is, said almost nothing at all as he walked away. Think about what this silence actually means. Clint Eastwood isn't just one legend retiring. He's the last representative of a specific way of making movies, and of a specific version of American manhood on screen that Hollywood no longer builds around. The industry today has little use for his stillness. It runs on speed, constant content, stars who talk their way through interviews and build a brand on camera. The kind of silence Eastwood perfected is close to the opposite of what modern Hollywood pays for. So the man who once had a Hollywood at his command became, almost without anyone noticing, someone the industry didn't quite know how to honor in real time. That's the uncomfortable math of endings. The industry celebrated him loudly at his peak and went quiet the moment it was time to honor his exit. It wanted him while he was useful, and it had already moved on by the time he wasn't. That's not a gossipy story about illness or a sensational headline. It's colder and more ordinary than that. The industry that made him doesn't run on loyalty. The moment you stop being useful to it, it stops saying your name. Think of someone in your own life or your own field who poured their career into something, and the moment they stepped away, the room just went quiet. What does that tell you about what the world actually values? Leave a comment. I'll read them. So where is Clint Eastwood now? He's alive, retired, and home in Carmel by the Sea, the small coastal town where he once served as mayor, a town he loves for the same reason he loves the open road. It's quiet. Away from the industry that demanded so much of his energy, he settled into the one chapter no director ever gets handed on screen: the ordinary business of being a private person at the end of a long, full career. His family is his center now. His son Kyle, the musician, is the one who finally spoke for the family, alongside other children across a lifetime that was always lived on Eastwood's own terms. He can no longer hide what time does to a person, and no one can. The man who once moved like an efficient, in-control machine, who directed entire films with a single day's discipline, has reached a point where the world moves faster than he does. Watching a man who could once do almost anything finally stand still isn't a tragedy in the headline sense. It's the ordinary, humbling fact of age, the one thing even the strongest, most self-reliant, quietest man can't outrun. The silence he's living in now isn't one that embarrasses him. It's the same silence he always trusted, just filling the space where the work used to be. Here's the thing worth holding on to. Eastwood built a legend on one idea: that a man doesn't need to explain himself, that the strongest among us can carry weight in silence, that the voice that speaks the least often has the most to say. That idea made him a star and an artist, and it made him one of the most respected filmmakers in the history of the medium. It's also the same idea that made his exit look, to the outside world, so still. An industry built on noise didn't quite know what to do with a man who leaves without a speech. It wanted a farewell, and he gave it a film and a silence. It wanted drama, and he gave it the plain truth of getting old. Maybe that's the last lesson he was teaching all along: that an ending doesn't have to be loud to be real, that the strongest way to leave is often the one that requires saying the least, and that a life spent showing up eventually meets the one thing no one outruns, and the dignified way through it is to keep being exactly who you've always been. He taught the world that silence can be powerful, that discipline can be its own kind of freedom, that a man who stands on his own can also stand alone. And in his own final chapter, he's doing that, standing still, quiet, home, doing the hardest and most human thing any of us will do: ending. Before you go, one last question, bigger than any single celebrity, and it's the one this whole story has been circling. When someone you admire reaches the end of their road and the world around them goes quiet, what is that silence actually saying? That they no longer matter? Or that they mattered so much that no amount of noise could ever be enough? That's the question at the center of this story, and it's one every one of us will meet in some form in our own lives. If this moved you, if something about Eastwood's long, quiet career, his insistence on doing the work and refusing to perform, reflected something you're going through, leave a like as a tribute to the last of a kind. Subscribe if you want more stories about the people who built the world we live in, and the moments they walked away from it. Tell us in the comments, what does silence mean to you in a world that never stops talking? Because the biggest lesson Eastwood ever gave might not be in any single movie. It might be this: in a world built to reward noise, it's often the person who learns to be still, who does the work and says very little and stands alone, who gets remembered the longest. Keep going, even when no one's watching, especially then.